the groups that exist there and the other Shia militias that exist in Iraq, all of these groups cost money. They are increasingly equipped with advanced weaponry that none of them, you can't buy it at Walmart, and none of them know how to make it. It's being provided by the Iranians. And that costs money. Where's that money coming from?
Part of that deal was freezing money and giving Iran back the money that it had. The way that the Trump administration is saying, and the president himself is saying, that President Obama gave them cash. Do you agree with that assertion?
Well, irrespective of the origins of the money and the fact that it had been frozen, it was cash. And that cash was used. And if you look at what they spend money on, they spend money on sponsoring terrorists, and they spend money on developing ballistic missiles. I think it's absolutely fair to say that the Iran deal helped finance the capabilities they now have to launch those missiles yesterday, and the capabilities they have to target Americans using proxy groups that they believe provides them deniability. And that risk still exists. I think what's changed is they understand that when this president says if an American is killed, there's going to be a response, it's not some talking point or a tweet. It's real because of the death of Soleimani.
Senator, do you see any role for Congress at this point, legislative or otherwise?
Well, first of all, I think any help that they need in terms of continuing to ensure that we pass spending here that allows our military to have the capabilities to respond is important. I think consultations like this with Congress are also very important in terms of input that we may have and advice that we might be able to give. But if you're referring to an AUMF, that is silly. It is ridiculous. You do not need, first of all, we don't need an AUMF to react defensively. And that this administration is not talking about invading Iran or starting another Gulf War or massive troop deployments for a massive and extended deployment inside the territory of Iran or anything of that nature. It is talking about what it will do if we are attacked. That is called self-defense. And every president is authorized by the Constitution of the United States, not just authorized, but required to protect the United States, and particularly our men and women when we deploy them abroad. Number two, he is particularly compelled to do so when the men and women who we are protecting are deployed in Iraq under a congressional authorization. The troops that are in Iraq are there under a congressional authorization that was passed that allows them and authorizes for them to be there. But we never need congressional authority in this country to act in the defense of our troops. And that's what this administration has done. They have been very clear they don't seek to start a war. And if there is military action, it will be in response to Iranian or proxy actions, not because we started it first.
Senator, what do you say to your Democratic colleagues who say they don't see what the long-term strategy is? They, regardless of what has happened in the last 24, 48 hours, where do they say that they don't have evidence of what the president wants to do to solve the Iran problem over the long run?
I don't know where they're looking, because I can tell you that it's pretty apparent what the strategy is, and that is that Iran needs to abandon any sort of nuclear weapons ambitions. It needs to stop sponsoring terrorist groups, and it needs to stop developing ballistic long-range missiles. And if it does those three things...
How do you get there, I guess?
Well, I think, guys, that's one of the reasons why we have relied on economic pressure. And you saw the president outline today the hope that other nations, particularly signatories to the JCPOA, would join in that effort. I think the strike alone points to why any future Iran deal must include ballistic missiles and the sponsorship of terrorism. I think that's the strategy. It's not a very complicated one. We want Iran to act like a normal country. All right?
What was the specific tripwire that triggered Friday night's attack? I don't think that's how
I'm getting too much canvas.
Right. You feed at the end before breaking down.
What are you going to do about that? I'll let it happen again. She's been here. No, you can't stay here. She's been here. They pushed up against me. It was either I pushed you. She was here. She was here for a half hour.
Well, yeah. Jared is the end, as we worked out, Scott.
Well, that's fine.
You negotiated before.
I didn't negotiate. You can't negotiate unless you're in a position to say no. So no.
Yeah, we had a good briefing that I think did address both the issues of imminence of threat and opportunity to take out a mastermind of terror that was the top terrorist operative for the #1 state sponsor of terror, Iran. Every member of the Senate, I'm on the Intel Committee, but every member of the Senate has had access since I think late May to a book of activities specifically related to this person and the rising tempo and intensity of what Soleimani was willing to do, was doing, and in the number of attacks all over the world, his relationship with the Houthi, his relationship with Hezbollah, his relationship with Syria. Pretty unusual that we would have that kind of focus and encourage every member of the Senate to take the time to look at that kind of focus on one individual, and I thought it was a good briefing.
You mentioned a lot of activity from Soleimani from months and years past. Were you convinced that there was this imminent threat that required urgent action last week?
And I think we had a sense in today's briefing that they were confident that his activities were likely to come to a significant head within days of the day he was killed. One question earlier from somebody else was, well, this person's been running the Quds Force for a long time. Why was he of a greater danger than he was 3 years ago or 5 years ago? And let me go back to the encouragement of every senator to look at his activities starting in the late spring of this year. That was a different level of activity and a different willingness to take risk and engage in ways that Americans could lose life than we had seen from Soleimani before or from the Iranians in a while. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator.
Hello. As I've long said, and you've heard me say for years, if Iran wanted to start a fight, the United States could end it, and that's exactly what happened over the last 10 days. Qasem Soleimani was Iran's terrorist mastermind, responsible for the death of thousands of Americans. He deserved exactly what he got, and America and the world is now safer because of it.
Senator, how would you characterize the attack that the Iranians leveled back at us last week?
A feckless and anemic attack.
And what's your response to the president's address today? Did he de-escalate?
Iran de-escalated. Iran didn't just take an off-ramp, they took a U-turn because they know they have no capability to fight against America, a technologically superior adversary. They also know that we will no longer allow them deniability if they try to use their terrorist proxies throughout the region. If a single American is harmed, as the president has long said, they will face severe consequences. That's what happened on December 27th, and the consequences they faced were severe. Thank you all.
Right behind you, pardon. So yeah, they basically wrote Harry, please come back to this one. They're becoming Canadian. I mean, they put out a statement saying the consultations are. Senator Harris?
Senator Harris?
Senator Harris?
Shelby. Senator Warren. Meckle, high, meckle, tiny, ho. Oh wait, that other
Boxing.
boxing.
Standing right where I'm supposed to be. I'll get you out of the way. I'll get you. What do you? Okay, we can figure out. Durban's coming. Senator Durbin, you have a moment for the cameras? Senator Durbin. He's over there. Senator Warren, will you keep on the camera? Senator Warren.
Senator Warren.
Senator Warren.
Cameras. For Iowa.
Oh, that got ugly. Oh, that got ugly.
Glad I got her to go ahead. Does anybody think that Pompeo is actually going to vote? He's going to have a big handshake.
Yeah, or like for the other senator. Okay, cool. So I don't need to send that. Thank you.
And we missed.
just don't know. Oh yeah, Kane coming. Kane.
Senator Kane. All I will just say is this. It is a far cry from meeting a standard of imminent threat. They had to leave pretty quickly, so about 10 of the attending senators, 10 to 15, got to ask questions, and many others did not get to ask questions, but at least based on the presentation that was made, it does not meet what I consider to be an imminent threat.
How
I think
soon?
the administration is tomorrow. Do you have a comment?
Senator Menendez.
Senator Menendez.
I went into this briefing today. I went into this briefing today with some critical questions that I wanted to hear the answers to. The imminency of the threat, the nature of the threat, the intelligence that would lead us to understand that eliminating Soleimani alone would eliminate the threat. And I walk away not only unsatisfied, but it draws real concerns for me that we do not have the type of information that is critical for members of the United States Senate to make. Don't feel too bad. That's what they did to us as well. They closed the briefing rather quickly. So, anyhow, we have more questions than we have answers at the end of the day.
Watch yourselves.
Have you talked to him?
Just a quick, I'm Tom Carper, Delaware. Just a quick history lesson. 5 or 6 years ago, the idea came up, well, why don't we try to negotiate a deal to reduce the likelihood that Iran will develop nuclear weapons? Some folks in this body thought that was a bad idea. Actually, some folks in Iran thought that was a bad idea. They thought that they should not engage with us. But they did, and we reached an agreement. An agreement called the JCPOA. It worked. Among the people in Iran who thought it was a bad idea, who thought they should not negotiate the JCPOA, was Soleimani. They thought it was a bad idea to negotiate, a bad idea to actually enter into that agreement. You know what happened with that agreement? Iran kept the agreement. 17 rounds of inspections, 17-0, they kept their word. There were elections 3 years ago. You know what happened in those elections? The moderates swept the field. Elections, city councils, mayors, the parliament. Today, the moderates have been diminished. And you know who's been raised up? The radicals, the Ayatollah, people like Soleimani. That is not a victory. At least that's not the kind of victory I think we want.
So, Senator Murphy, Senator Merkley, and I, and others, we just want to make a few comments about our takeaway from this briefing. You know, we can read about the judgments administration officials make in the newspapers and in the media. These intelligence briefings are supposed to focus on facts behind the judgments, so we can make an independent evaluation of the judgments that are being made. And I would say that the briefing was incredibly thin on facts, and to the extent that they provided facts, in my judgment, they did not support any claim of an imminent threat that would justify the actions they've taken with respect to eliminating Soleimani. And it's important that you have that justification. It was one they gave. I did notice in President Trump's remarks at the White House today, he mentioned that they were engaged in planning attacks. The president himself didn't use the word imminent this morning at the White House. And it's an important distinction because I just want to everyone to think about this. We're engaged in a very, very tense situation with Iran even before the latest actions. The United States military plans what targets it will hit under certain circumstances. It's not surprising that the Iranians will also determine what targets they may hit if they are attacked by the Americans. So the idea that people might be planning to take certain actions is not surprising, just as we plan to take certain actions under certain circumstances. So the takeaway from my perspective is that they did not establish in any way the facts that would support the claim of an imminent threat that was posed, meaning that someone had decided to attack U.S. forces and kill lots of Americans. Let me turn it over to Senator Murphy.
Yeah, let me concur with Senator Van Hollen's analysis. I was deeply surprised at the lack of information presented by the administration regarding a specific imminent threat. This appears to me to be a strike of choice by this administration, one that likely would have required congressional authorization beforehand. The consequences of this strike already in the first 6 days have been cataclysmic. Our troops are being pushed out of Iraq. Iran has started its nuclear weapons program again. All counter-ISIL operations have been halted. There are serious political consequences to the decision that was made. And we did not get information inside that briefing that there was a specific imminent threat that we were halting through the operation conducted last Thursday night. And I can say I was, I think, both surprised and saddened to not have that information before us. I think it is likely because it doesn't exist. But the fullness of the briefing is complicated by the fact that it only lasted 75 minutes. After waiting 6 days, the administration barely gave 100 senators an hour. We left with multiple important questions that were still unanswered. And I frankly think it's not just unacceptable to not present intelligence, if it exists, but it's also not sufficient to give the United States Senate just over an hour of time to explain a military action that likely has grave long-term consequences for our security.
I'm just going to say one thing and then let my colleagues take over. There were so many important questions that they did not answer. We did not see a plan, a satisfying plan for the future. We had 97 senators there. 15 got to ask questions. As the questions began to get tough, they walked out. I've asked for a commitment that they all come back within a week. We have not yet gotten that commitment. Thank you.
One of the things that was very troubling is there was no indication that there was due thought given to the consequences of the action. Before the action against Soleimani, we had massive protests in Iran against the Iranian government, and now we have massive protests against the U.S. No clarity that this was understood how it would affect the unity for the radicals and undermine the moderates in Iran. No sense that they had considered that the fact of an attack in Iraq without the permission of the Iraqi government would undermine the authority of the Iraqi government, which had a formal relationship with the militias. No sense that they would interrupt, if you will, the training of the troops who are taking on ISIS. No sense of how this would impact the increase in nuclear refinement being done, enrichment being done by Iraq. No sense that they had considered how this would put the assets of our allies at risk. In fact, quite frankly, there was no presentation at all of a comprehensive understanding of how the consequences might hurt all of our strategic initiatives in the region. And in that sense, this was very frustrating. It seemed to reflect a very rushed and reckless action.
In addition to what my colleagues have said, as we look forward, one of the things that concern me as well is that looking at the new race to a nuclear weapon for Iran and the fact that the president has said he will not let that happen, when asked whether or not they would come back to us before taking action going forward, they weren't willing to answer that. So what is the threshold? What happens when the intelligence says that Iran is within 6 months or 3 months of a nuclear weapon, and they then choose to take action? Does that require congressional consent? I would argue yes, it does. And we had no indication at all from them that they might feel they needed to come to Congress to get support for that action. It was deeply concerning today.
The last thing I would say is I think we all know that Iran and Soleimani's strategic objective in Iraq has all along been to push out the United States and reduce our influence in Iraq. They've been very open about that for years. And our strike, what we did, actually is allowing Iran and Soleimani in death, not in life, to be able to accomplish that objective because we've already seen actions calling for the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces. There is no doubt that our position in Iraq today is weaker than it was before. And I think we are all seeing the result
Senator
of that
Van
right
Hollen,
now.
Can you explain why it seems like Republicans had a totally different briefing, that they seem convinced that there was this?
They'll have to explain to you that.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I just sat through one of the best briefings I've had since I've been here in the United States Congress. You had people who gave absolute, crystal clear information that the president and the national security people had when they made the decision to take out Soleimani. What you come away with after listening to the Democrats question these people is there is so much hate and vitriol and animosity against this president that they are willing to put at risk lives of American citizens and American military people. After listening to the information that the president had, the CIA had, the security people had, the people who do intelligence work had, it would have been negligent, it would have been reckless, and it would have been an intentional disregard for the safety of Americans for the president not to act and not to take out Soleimani. Thank you very much.
Good luck, honey.
Are you calling it on the pool, or how long are you
watch out because we may still get some. Gary, we're not done yet. Water has to come out.
We have more people coming?
Yes. New York, if you can hear me, let me get a few more.
Is there someone that you have that I can tell to?
Say that again? Thank you.
I'll bring it down. Yeah.
Doesn't your network want to
They left. Warner left. There's so many ways to get out of there. You can't like, you might still be in there. Oh, wait, did you say Warner was coming?
No, he hasn't come out. He's
Oh, yeah.
right now.
Let's go. Warner's coming.
Chairman Mark, or Senator Mark Warner of the Intelligence Committee is coming right now.
Yeah, so we won't run it as a prayer until
Senator Warner.
Senator Warner.
I literally looked right at him and I pointed the microphone.
last time Bernie made a statement.
I haven't seen you in forever.
Are you here now?
I'm helping out on the team for 6th November, so I'm here until
First day of our honeymoon was the day that they fired me. And then several other
You're in the bottom of the
and then
like the Stakeout.
no, but wait, so two. Sam's almost 21. So he's, in fact, we're like in the market trying to like move out of the burbs. Campus is the city, and then our most will be in Virginia Public University, and then so I think we're going to do like a maybe move to the market. Figure it out after Be careful. We're not
Whose mic is? Somebody stuck their mic with you. Whose mic is this? Who's this?
Yeah,
Pablo,
we're a
which
long
one
way.
are you?
You've got a ways to go. So that's your
Okay. Excuse me.
So it's we are firmly on.
Who's this? Is this you? Kept with my mic?
There you go, Pablo.
That's you? Are you okay to take it out? Yeah.
And my daughter, like at 6,
Yeah, you can take it off.
more normal.
We have a bad night. Like every week.
Yeah, that's doable. So are you back?
Yeah, Sunday night was my dad. Getting out of the woods.
Thank you.
What time do you have to get there for the show?
It was turning. It's an upside down world.
Good to see you again.
He left. He'd rather watch. Everybody expected burning, but there's votes. Voters. Okay. Oh, Haskell. Maybe she'll take a question. Just get the shot. Get the shot. Director Haskell, anything you'd like to share? I tried to get a photo because Pompeo was sneering him, and then
This is the best I could do.
no, but Pompeo was like right there.
no.
He saw me then. He was just like, he wanted to do it, but then he was like,
He waited about 5 seconds.
How did you feel after?
I came away from this briefing, I don't know what my colleagues have said, I came away from this briefing really angry, deeply dissatisfied that after waiting this long for the facts that justified the killing of the second in command of a foreign government, that the answers were unacceptably vague and unspecific. In fact, my takeaway from this briefing was that it raised more questions than it answered. I have more questions now than I did before I went into this briefing. And frankly, I'm hopeful that the situation is de-escalating, but in some ways I'm more frightened about this situation than I was before.
what was so vague and unimpressive about it?
The same question was asked multiple times and the same answer given,
What was the question?
but that question was essentially unanswered. And I can't go into what, as you well know, I can't go into what the questions were and what the answers were. I can tell you that I would not have accepted this kind of briefing if I had been a state official, as I was for many years, and I were appearing before a judge in our court.
Why do you think all the Republicans have all come out here and said it was a great briefing, they learned a lot? Senator Rich said it was one of the best briefings he's ever had since he's been in Congress. Why such a difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on this? Why do you think?
My fear is that our national security has fallen victim to the polarization that we've seen on so many issues. But my hope is that we can come together on a path that de-escalates the potential military confrontation that we saw building over these last few days.
Thank you, Senator. Suppose you two feel differently.
I'm not sure what he said. I'll tell you how I feel, and then Senator Paul is going to share how he feels. We just left the briefing, and we were talking about Iran. I want to state at the outset, I support President Trump. I support and respect the manner in which he has approached his commander-in-chief powers. I believe that more than any other president in my lifetime, President Trump has shown a lot of restraint. He's been reluctant to get us involved in wars all over the globe. He's been very mindful and respectful of the fact that when the American people are asked to give up blood and treasure, they're sending off their sons and their daughters, their moms and their dads into battlefield. And he's therefore very careful about it. I respect that enormously. My comments at the moment are not directed toward the attack that occurred on Friday. We'll leave that to another day. I will say that we were brought into this briefing today to talk to us about that attack on Friday. I had hoped and expected to receive more information outlining the legal, factual, and moral justification for the attack. I was left somewhat unsatisfied on that front. The briefing lasted only 75 minutes, whereupon our briefers left. This, however, is not the biggest problem I have with the briefing, which I would add was probably the worst briefing I've seen, at least on a military issue, in the 9 years I've served in the United States Senate. What I found so distressing about that briefing was that one of the messages we received from the briefers was, do not debate, do not discuss the issue of the appropriateness of further military intervention against Iran. And that if you do, you'll be emboldening Iran. The implication being that we would somehow be making America less safe by having a debate or a discussion about the appropriateness of further military involvement against the government of Iran. Now, I find this insulting and demeaning, not personally, but to the office that each of the 100 senators in this building happens to hold. I find it insulting and I find it demeaning to the Constitution of the United States, to which we've all sworn an oath. It is, after all, the prerogative of the legislative branch to declare war. Article 1, Section 8 makes that very clear. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Number 69 made clear that this was a sharp contrast from the form of government that we had prior to the Revolution, a form of government in which the executive, the king, had the power to take us to war. He did not need the Parliament to weigh in on it, to support it. That was the Parliament's job after the fact, after we had gone into war. This, Hamilton explained in Federalist 69, is exactly the reason why this power was put in Article 1, Section 8, in the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. When we send our brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into harm's way, we owe the American people the decent courtesy to follow the Constitution, to debate and discuss these actions. For them to tell us that either through a War Powers Act resolution or otherwise, for us to debate and discuss these things on the Senate floor would somehow weaken the American cause and embolden Iran in any other actions, I find very insulting. Now look, I hope that they'll come back and they'll say, no, you misunderstood us. We didn't say that at all. I wish I could believe that. I will note that when those words were uttered, not one of the briefers stood in objection. Not one of the briefers pushed back on that and said, we want to make clear that this is still the constitutional prerogative of Congress. I also want to make clear that I walked into that briefing undecided as to whether to support the resolution under the War Powers Act introduced by Senator Kaine. Now, Senator Kaine and I have had some discussions. I've got some concerns with some of the language, particularly in some of the whereas clauses that he's introduced. He's agreed to make some changes. And I can say that after that briefing is what changed my mind. That briefing is what brought me on board, together with the amendments that Senator Kaine has agreed to make. I'm now going to support it. I walked into the briefing undecided. I walked out decided, specifically because of what happened in that briefing. It is not acceptable for officials within the executive branch of government, I don't care whether they're with the CIA, with the Department of Defense, or otherwise, to come in and tell us that we can't debate and discuss the appropriateness of military intervention against Iran. It's un-American, it's unconstitutional, and it's wrong. And I hope and expect that they will show greater deference to their own limited power in the future, and to the power that belongs to Congress. This is not about us, it's not about any one of us. This is about our fidelity to those we represent. These powers are not ours. They don't belong to any of us. But when we allow them to be exercised through the wrong branches of government, with the wrong process, when you don't have debate and discussion, you don't allow the process itself to correct itself for the American people who will be most affected by these decisions to weigh in. That was insulting. That was demeaning to the process ordained by the Constitution, and I find it completely unacceptable. On that basis, I've decided to support Senator Kaine's resolution, subject to the minor amendments that he and I discussed earlier today. Senator Paul.
Thank you. I joined Senator Lee in making the decision to also support the War Powers resolution. I wanted to hear the intelligence first. What I hear was less than satisfying, but one of the arguments that's been bandied about in public I think is particularly insulting to logic, the Constitution, and the intent of our founding fathers. The argument has been made that the use of authorization of force voted on in 2002 to go to war with Saddam Hussein and his government is justification for anything they want to do in Iraq today, including killing an Iranian general. I see no way in the world you could logically argue that an authorization to have war with Saddam Hussein has anything to do with having war with people currently in Iraq. I think we need to have a debate about the separation of powers. I too am a supporter of the president. I consider myself to be a friend of the president. I think the president's instincts on trying to show restraint and keep us out of war are good. I frankly think he will not unnecessarily escalate things. However, the debate is bigger than just this debate. The debate is a 70-year-long debate that began in 1950 with Korea and Truman. This is a debate, and many have written that Congress has abdicated their duty. Today, this is Senator Lee and I stepping up and saying, we are not abdicating our duty. Our duty under the Constitution is for us to debate when we go to war, and we, for one, are not going to abdicate that duty. We'll be happy to take questions.
Could you guys, I know there's very little you can say about the details, but could you give us a better sense of who exactly was saying this to you, that you should debate this? Was it all of them? Was it a specific cabinet member or agency director?
You know, before I comment on that publicly, I'd really like to have a conversation with the president so I can make him aware of what we were told and by whom. But I will say that the messages we received didn't get any pushback internally from the briefers. What we were told over and over again was, look, this action was necessary. This was a bad guy. We had to do it. And we can't have division. We can't have dissension within our ranks, within our government, or else it sends the wrong signal to the Iranians. And I think that's completely wrong. They were asked repeatedly, what, if anything, would trigger the need for the administration to come back to Congress for a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force. At one point, I believe one of the briefers said something along the lines of, I'm sure we could think of something. But they struggled to identify anything. They were asked specifically, well, what about if you concluded, well, it's not my point to get into that here. I don't want to accidentally say anything classified. My point is, they were asked a number of hypotheticals about situations in which they might have to appropriately come and ask for authorization for Congress. Not once did they say, yes, we'd need to do it in that circumstance. At one point, one of the briefers said something like, don't worry, we'll consult you. Well, with history as our guide, consultation isn't necessarily the same thing as authorization for the use of military force. A declaration of war or an AUMF is what the Constitution requires, and drive-by notification or after-the-fact lame briefings like the one we just received aren't adequate.
Do you think the president should have carried out this attack against Soleimani?
Look, I'm still agnostic as to that, Manu. I still haven't had the questions answered that I came into that briefing expecting to ask. They left after 75 minutes. Now, I understand these are busy people. They've got a lot of demands on their time. They're appearing before a coordinate branch of government responsible for their funding, for their confirmation, for any approval of any military action they might undertake. They had to leave after 75 minutes while they're in the process of telling us that we need to be good little boys and girls and run along and not debate this in public. I find that absolutely insane. I think it's unacceptable. And so I don't know what they had in mind. I went in there hoping to get more specifics as far as the factual, legal, moral justification for what they did. I'm still undecided on that issue, in part because we never got to the details. Every time we got close, they'd say, well, we can't discuss that here because it's really sensitive. We're in a skiff. We're in a secure underground bunker where all electronic devices have to be checked at the door, and they still refuse to tell us. I find that really upsetting.
Did you get a sense that they were not taking it seriously, almost like they didn't want to be there?
No, look, the fact that they were here shows they were taking it seriously. But some of the underlying questions did not appear to be taken seriously by some of them in some of what they told us.
Who did most of the talking on their side? Was it mostly Secretary Pompeo?
No, I would say there was the time was pretty evenly distributed between the briefers.
So Pompeo is a former member of the House. Do you think he no longer respects members of Congress?
I'm not going to speak as to the subjective mindset of any of the briefers, as to whether they respect us or not. I know only that I came in there with a lot of questions, and that when I left, those questions remained unanswered. And I walked out of there not only without answers to all the questions that I had, but having been told that we shouldn't debate this too much because it might be harmful.
Have either of you read the House Democratic War Powers resolution that's going to be brought up for a vote tomorrow?
I haven't read that. I've read Senator Kane's resolution.
Welcome the debate at least, if they send something over.
Sure. Look, after today, every time they pull a stunt like this, I'm willing to consider and introduce any and every War Powers Act resolution.
Paul, you mentioned that they used the justification of the Iraq AUMF. So if they were they basically arguing that because the strike took place on Iraqi soil, that covered it?
I don't want to discuss anything they said in there. The only reason I mentioned that is it's been in the newspaper also. I think it was Blair, the National Security Advisor, argues that 2002, the authorization to go to war with Saddam Hussein authorizes them to do whatever they want. So they have justified the killing of an Iranian general as being something that Congress gave them permission to do in 2002. That is absurd. That's an insult. And every time someone writes that Congress needs to take back their authority on war, that's what we're here to do. Let's have the debate, and let's have some senators stand up, and let's see if we can really, truly have a debate over who has the power to declare war. The reason it was put in and why every founding father said they were taking power away from the president is because they didn't want perpetual war. The president says he doesn't want endless war. Well, the way you have less war is by having less troops in the Middle East and also by having a more fulsome debate about when we go to war.
Is the president being ill-served by this national security team?
I'm not prepared to say that. I'm telling you only this administration was ill-served by this briefing today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I feel like I'm
Quickly, yeah. Can we do something live quickly from here?
Yeah, when do you want to go?
Like right now?
Right now, let's do right now.
Okay.
We'll do right now for you. We have a CBS hit. They can do that. Everybody else can go if you want. But please be mindful of what's going on.